Hello, this is Jacob Hornberger with Sheldon Richmond, and this is the Libertarian Angle. I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and Sheldon is vice president. And we're here to give you the Libertarian Angle on the current controversies of the day. Sheldon, what do you think of the big sequestration? I mean, I was there pacing the floor and nervous as I could be and, thinking, oh my gosh, the world's going to fall apart. That country's going to fall into the ocean. Because, those were the warnings they were telling us up to about 2 weeks before the sequestration. But it was really funny because about 2 weeks before the sequestration came about, all the mainstream commentators on the newspapers and in the television networks and stuff, they realized that a deal might not be cut, and therefore all their little dark scenario strategy might not come to pass. And so they had to silence themselves because they realized that if they kept painting this dark scenario, which of course they always do, catastrophe is going to strike America, that people would figure out that it was all a bunch of bull. And sure enough, it's turned out to be a bunch of bull. Now, of course, we're catching all the scary stories about how Northern Virginia and the Washington, D.C. area is going to get hurt. Well, these are people on the dole. I mean, they've been able to do this scam since 9/11, all the defense contractors and all the people that employ. I mean, the counties around here, Sheldon, are among the richest counties in the United States. And that's because everybody's sucking here at the public trough with this whole scary scenario about how the terrorists are going to invade and conquer America. It's essentially Smedley Butler's whole scenario. It's just one great big racket. What's your take on it?
Well, that's right. You should have listened to me because while you were losing sleep, wondering, when the sky was going to fall in, I was sleeping like a baby because I knew nothing was going to happen. Obama has been caught, even by the mainstream media now, caught in telling these fairy tales about the horrors that were going to happen. He said the other day, he said janitors were going to be laid off, and the White House and the Capitol immediately announced, "No, we haven't told anybody they're being laid off. We're not laying anybody off." I mean, they're all getting caught, and as some lobbyist was quoted recently saying, the worst case scenario is that sequestration goes through and nobody notices it. Nothing happens. That's the worst case scenario. It's really quite a joke. I mean, when you think of you don't need to be a libertarian to realize this is a joke, really. I mean, you can be for a fairly large government and still say people being upset about this tiny thing called sequestration is just hilarious. There's so many overlapping programs. There are multiple job training programs. So even if you believe in government job training, there's like 17 programs. You mean to tell me they can't cut less than 3% out of those budgets? I mean, they really maybe have overplayed their hand here now, and maybe there'll be some turning in public opinion, at least. Maybe not all the way we'd like to see it go, but people finally saying, look, these politicians just don't tell us the truth. And when they say a tiny cut is going to be a catastrophe, we're now going to realize they've been crying wolf all this time, and we're going to not believe them anymore. That would be one good thing to come out of this episode.
No, what's fascinating though is the blackmail that's involved in this too. Is that you often hear, like I said last week's show, about how there's all this waste, fraud, and abuse that they're committed to getting rid of, and yet what they're doing now is pulling out the things that people would notice most. Like I saw that one town was losing their air traffic controller. And so they're picking out the things that are highlighting. I saw where the Thunderbirds are saying, we're not going to do any more shows. Apparently that's going to really affect people. And, it's sort of a blackmail where they say, you give us everything we want because we won't use the savings to get rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse. We're going to hit you where it hits you the hardest. And then you're going to come and give our take on this. Why do people put up with this, Sheldon? It's just so incredible to me.
Yeah, well, of course, a lot of people really don't know better, but that's why I say I think they might have overplayed their hand in this case, because you're seeing the major papers beginning to call Obama and some of the others on this and say, look, you've way exaggerated to the point where you're not telling the truth. It's just a lie to say some bad thing's going to happen when there's so much fad. Like I said, you don't even need to be a libertarian to see this point, because there's so much of what anyone would regard as waste. You know, as libertarians, we can say these whole agencies ought to just be canceled because we don't even think the mission, if it was efficiently done, we would say the mission should be canceled. But and a lot of people don't agree with us on that. But here it's very clear to see that it's you can even have your mission, and yet there's still all this fat that could be cut, and they cry about a 2.7% cut in in actual outlays in the discretionary part of the budget, and maybe people are starting to realize politicians lie routinely, especially when their own power base is at stake. And these politicians have to look like they're in there fighting for their constituencies and the special interest groups that return them to office, every 2 years or 4 or 6 years. And so, yeah, it's been kind of a circus, and I'm actually sort of pleased the way the media has been receiving it, because it's I think they're beginning to get a little jaundiced, which is progress, really. There's progress.
Yeah, but my hunch is we're going to hear it all again when the debt ceiling debate comes up, that if the debt ceiling isn't raised, America's going to fall into the ocean and the sky is going to fall and so forth. And we're going to hear these Keynesian arguments again. I mean, the same stuff that, if we decrease government spending, that's going to throw us back into the recession and stuff. Would you talk to people here about the whole fallacies of this whole Keynesian paradigm under which we've all been born and raised here in America?
Well, that is a big part of it. You hear, there's a New York Times story today that says these unnamed experts say that 700,000 jobs are going to be eliminated because of sequestration. Those aren't just government jobs. I guess they count some of those as government workers who may be furloughed, as they put it. But they also try to build in this sort of negative multiplier idea. So if you lay off a government worker, or if a contractor lays off a worker because the government is canceling a contract or not extending a contract, the theory is that person now is going to cut back his spending. Right? He's not going to go out as much. He's not going to go to restaurants. He's going to cut back a little bit on his groceries, and the retailers will see the cutback. Of course, this is not just one employee. It's supposedly, lots of employees. The retailer sees the cutback in spending and says, "Oh my gosh, I better lay off a few people because my sales are now down." And so he lays off people. Those people now cut back their spending because they just lost their jobs. And that means other retailers notice a fall in retail spending, so they lay off. So this is the Keynesian ripple, right? You have some fall in demand. Doesn't matter how it gets started, but then it ripples outward as people lay off more and more people because retail sales are falling. That's kind of the Keynesian story. Of course, the Keynesians don't care what people are making, so they don't want to see any government jobs eliminated purely because of this demand they believe will be subtracted from the economic system. Well, there's 2 points to be made. Number one, what are those people doing in the government jobs? Are they producing anything of value? We don't know because it's never subjected to a market test, right? The taxpayers have to pay. They don't have any choice. And the so-called product that government employees are producing is never put on the market for people to either say yes or no about. So there's no market test, so we don't know whether they're producing value. And on the other hand, they could be out in the market producing value. It's a little like Bastiat's broken window fallacy, right? You say, well, if they're not working for the government, they're out of work. But maybe if they're not working for the government, they stop doing a non-productive kind of job, which the government job, most likely is, and they go out in the private sector and they take up a productive job. So that's a twofer. It should be a twofer for the American people, right? You don't have people doing unproductive things, and instead they go out in the marketplace and do productive things. That ought to be a good thing. Now, okay, so that's the answer to the Keynes. But some people say, well, but wait a second, we haven't really come out of this recession. Unemployment is still, flirting with 8%. It's been high for a very long time. By historical standards, it's virtually a jobless recovery. I mean, I know that Obama boasts about all the jobs that have been created, but the economy has to create like 150,000 jobs a month just for the newcomers into the marketplace, into the workforce. So those numbers are a little misleading. Point is, unemployment is very high, and work participation, the portion of the population working, is historically low, and that's unusual for most recessions. Employment would have recovered by now, long before now, and it hasn't. So they say, well, how can you have sequestration, which is going to dump these people in the marketplace, when we already have a lot of people unemployed in the marketplace? And the proper answer to that, the free market answer, the Austrian answer, the libertarian answer, is the unemployment rate would fall if the government would get out of the way and not create regime uncertainty. Robert Higgs calls this regime uncertainty from new and pending regulations, and the effects of which no one can be certain about. So you have Obamacare, you have Dodd-Frank, the financial regulation regime that's been coming in, where the rules aren't even fully written yet. Nobody knows what the effect's going to be on business and business investment, and so people are reluctant to expand businesses or start new businesses and hire people. That's why unemployment seems to be stuck at that rate. And you got to attack the whole thing. It's not enough to just sequester a little bit of government spending. We need really, really deep cuts and total elimination of the agencies and departments and missions. But at the same time, you have to free up the private market, so that when you do kick government workers off their dole, they'll have a place to go, because there'll be a productive economy out there. That's, in a nutshell, what needs to be done.
Yeah, I think this whole thing is a fascinating display also of how many people in America have become dependent on the welfare warfare largesse. There's a lot of people freaking out, and you're talking about all the federal spending across the land, and then you've got all the defense contractors, and the Pentagon has been ingenious in terms of organizing all its little projects in every congressional district across the land, so that when something like this happens, every congressman starts freaking out and, oh my gosh, this is what's going to happen. We're going to lose all these jobs. And it really goes to show the extent to which this way of life that Americans adopted in the 20th century has such a deep and profound impact on the lives of the American people. But I take it the same way you do. You've got two separate sectors as far as I'm concerned. You've got the government sector and you've got the private sector. And the private sector is the productive sector. It's out there producing the wealth that is then confiscated to fund the public sector. And as the public sector has grown larger and larger and larger with each decade of spending, welfare programs, warfare programs, you've got to suck more and more productive wealth out of that private sector, so that when all of a sudden people say, let's reverse this trend, as we libertarians have said, and start dismantling the welfare warfare state, people freak out and say, oh, no, you're causing all this unemployment. All these federal workers are going to be unemployed. And you can see the freaking out already here in Washington, because people are having to take some slight cutbacks in pay or whatever. Well, as you point out, it's a doubly positive effect. If you lay off huge sectors of the public sector, then the private sector no longer has to have its money taken away from it. You've got all that productive wealth still in the hands of the private sector, but now those people that were in the public sector are now in the private sector. They're now producing wealth instead of confiscating wealth. It's a doubly positive thing. And the example I sometimes point to is Cuba. What should Cuba, where everybody who works for, everybody there works for the government, what should Cuba do? Dismantle it, fire everybody, and leave people free to operate in the private sector. That's the key to increasing standards of living and wealth, right, Sheldon?
Well, that's right. As World War II was winding down, the Keynesians were warning that if the government cut military spending, you would think that would be cut at the end of a war, but they were warning that if the government does that, and you got all these guys coming home from Europe and Asia, and then being discharged from the military, that the economy would sink back into the depression. That was a widely held view by economic experts of the day, who were almost entirely Keynesians. it didn't happen. There was a demobilization. There was a reduction, at least for a couple of years. There was a reduction in military spending. All those draftees were freed, and there was no depression. In fact, it was the beginning of some boom years because there was a huge amount of private investment. Robert Higgs has looked at the figures very closely on this, and it just did not happen. You didn't need, contrary to Keynes, you not need government to sustain the economy and to maintain full employment. Just beautiful historical disproof of Keynes's point. But to your larger point, you make a great point there. The defenders of the status quo, they really want it both ways. If you ever say to them, the American people have become way too dependent on government, they say you're wrong. They will insist that that's just not true. On the other hand, when you call for a 2.7% cut in discretionary spending, less than 3 cents on the dollar, they say the sky's going to fall. So I don't see how you can have it both ways. If the sky really is going to fall from such a small cut, then how can you say that the American people, the country's not overly dependent on the government? And they never are forced to confront those two things that they're maintaining, which both can't be true.
Yeah, your point about World War II is fantastic. I mean, here they lay off all these workers, so the Keynesian would say, oh my gosh, you're increasing unemployment. But you at the same time have relieved the productive sector of the tax burden of funding these soldiers. And so it's a doubly positive effect. The soldiers come back into the private sector. They're now producing wealth along with the people who are hiring them and so forth. But, Sheldon, I just got finished reading I think one of the greatest books I've ever read on the Pentagon, the vast military establishment, because as you know, they didn't really totally demobilize. You had the Pentagon that was started in 1941. The name of the book, by the way, is House of War by James Carroll. It was published in 2006, I believe. He's an op-ed writer for the Boston Globe. But Carroll goes into saying, that the Pentagon just stayed in existence after World War II. And then you've got the whole national security state establishment, CIA, that constantly grows. This whole warfare section grows and grows. And then, under the justification of the Cold War. But then when the Cold War is over, what happened? That the whole thing stayed in existence, growing by monumental bounds. They go out and provoke trouble in the Middle East. They stir up all these terrorist attacks. And now they're telling us that national security depends on the continued existence of these enormous budgets. I think we're spending on military stuff 10 times what all the other 10 other countries combined. I mean, it's incredible. And yet for what? I mean, you don't see people coming over on transport ships to invade and conquer America. You don't see millions of terrorists invading the United States. It's all this scare, this fear-mongering, and this is what Carroll thematically builds up in his book, is that they always need fear and crises and any kind of justification to get people scared to justify this huge, enormous burden on the American economy.
Yeah, and I was looking at the Pentagon figures with the sequester, and the worst case is that it takes the Pentagon back to 2006 or 2007 or 5 or 6, I forget which 2 years it is, which was more than in those years. That was more. The U.S. Pentagon was spending more than it was spending in 1985. When the Soviet Union existed, you could call that the height of the Cold War. So you might wonder why would the Pentagon need more money today than it needed at the height of the Cold War? And then, even though it gets set back to 2006, it will continue its upward trajectory from that point. And so over the 10 years with sequester, it'll end up spending, $5-some trillion. Without the sequester, it would have spent $6-some trillion. So we're not talking about big differences. And then when you plug in what your point about the very missions, then the whole thing looks really ridiculous. And anyone would be getting upset by this. Panetta was saying it would hollow out the military, and New York Times keeps talking about the deep cuts in the military. it's just a joke. And once you add our point that it shouldn't even be doing what it's doing, then it really looks like a joke, because Panetta was arguing that we wouldn't be able to respond. Well, the government shouldn't be responding to, it wants to be able to respond to any crisis anywhere in the world, because it's the U.S. business under this point of view. And, of course, we want to reverse that. So it shouldn't have the money and the means to respond to crises everywhere, because it should not be the manager of the world. It's that simple.
Yeah, that's really what one of the major differences, as far as I'm concerned, between libertarians and statists, both conservatives and liberals, is that we want to restore a constitutional republic to our land. And I just wrote a blog today about how our founding fathers steadfastly opposed standing armies. I mean, they feared standing armies as a threat to their liberty. And I quote Madison and all the others there that said, liberty and a standing army are irreconcilable. And yet, in a democracy, the Pentagon has been very, very successful in convincing people that this vast military establishment, or what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, is necessary to their safety. And so you've got troops all over the world, Europe, Korea, that ready to involve ourselves in faraway crises in order to justify the ever-increasing spending. And it's also unnecessary. I just finished another fantastic book called Target Switzerland by Hallbrook, I think Stephen Hallbrook, where he talks about the Swiss system, which, by the way, our founding fathers pointed to as a model for America when they were setting up our country, where they don't have troops overseas. They don't have troops in Korea. They don't have foreign aid to dictatorships. Their philosophy is national defense, genuine national defense. While over here, the Pentagon calls national defense all these interventions, sanctions, embargoes, none of the things the Swiss do. And by the way, nobody bothers the Swiss. The terrorists don't bother the Swiss. Nobody would dare to invade Switzerland because of its widespread gun ownership and its orientation toward genuine national defense. And I think that's where we've got to have a national debate, is whether this vast military establishment, national security state, is even necessary, and whether it's even reconcilable with the principles of a free society.
Right, I agree with that. Obviously, there's a big psychological hump to get over to even begin that conversation, which is summed up in the words indispensable nation and American exceptionalism. And that, of course, is reinforced all the time on the news media and in schools and everything else, that somehow, quote, we have to do this, no one else can, otherwise there won't be order in the world, which is really nonsense. Even the U.S., despite its ambitions, isn't managing everything. It's not managing relationships between every country in the world. There's close to 200 countries in the world, at least UN members, and most of the time, have perfectly peaceful relations, even though there is no global government managing things. Like I said, the U.S. is busy in particular places, but luckily it's not trying to manage everything. It seems to know it can't quite do that. It would be stretched a little thin. And so that just goes to undermine this whole point that the U.S. is necessary to keep order in the world. And that's what we have to teach people, so they can let go of that. Until they learn that, they're going to think, well, okay, I don't really like it. It's expensive. Taxes are high because of it. People get killed because of it, but darn it, if we were to withdraw, this is what they've always learned, right? If we were to withdraw from the world, if we were to become isolationist, disorder would break out everywhere, and we would really regret it. We have to teach people that that's not the case. That's a tough job, but that's what we have to do.
Yeah, that's the mindset that's been inculcated from the first grade up. You mentioned schools, and maybe we ought to discuss that in one of our future shows, is the power of the state educational system to mold people's minds into believing that this is necessary for their safety and for this term national security, and then also the welfare state, how the welfare state, is necessary to prevent people from dying in the streets of starvation or disease and whatever. I think the schools have played a major role in that. And of course, you point that out in your book, Separating School and State. And I think that we need to address that at some point, is why is it that people fall for this? And of course it makes our job that much more difficult. And anyway, Sheldon, that's the show for this week. Greatly enjoyed the conversation with you, and look forward to having it with you again next week.